a moment from the past. Anacaona's dream. When Anacaona was 9 years old, she and her father, the ticitl Chimalli, lived on the outskirts of Texcoco. One night she had a dream that she remembered so vividly it was as if it had happened in reality. In this dream, Anacaona left her house and launched into the sky. She didn't have wings, and she didn't have to move her arms. Anacaona controlled her body with her mind and could fly in any direction. She flew over Lake Texcoco, and the majestic Tenochtitlan appeared ahead. Anacaona flew over the long bridge that connected the shore to the city. The city was in the middle of a lake like a big island, a big, beautiful city on the water. In flight, Anacaona felt as if she were gliding over the waves of a sea. Rushing downward, she picked up speed, then abruptly soared up toward the stars. The sky was brightening behind the silhouette of the mountains. Sunrise was beginning. Anacaona was flying over the city now. She sailed over the Chinampas, huge floating gardens on the water that surrounded the outskirts of the city. Chinampas always amazed Anacaona. They were artificial structures. Piles were driven into the bottom of the lake, connected with wattles, and then earth was filled in. Everything that farmers and gardeners needed was planted on this land. In the case of high water, the plantings were not washed away by the currents. The crops simply floated on the surface along with the land on which they grew. Harvests were always plentiful. One benefit of the Chinampas was that the land was fertilized by what was collected right there from the bottom of the lake. Below Anacaona, gardeners were sailing their boats to the thickets of mango, banana palms, orange, and fruit trees. Some of them were rubbed with the juice of plants to protect them from mosquitoes and midges. Where the long and wide Chinampas ended, the market began. Anacaona noticed some merchants pointing at her. However, many did not even pay attention to her, as if the girl's flight over the city was an ordinary event. The merchants had more important things to do. They laid out vegetables and fruits on their counters, both locally grown in the Chinampas and brought from the shore. Turning right, Anacaona found herself above a long straight street. Someone was just leaving home below her. Many were on their way to work, and someone, conversely, was returning home from night service. A woman standing on the side of the road was shaking out a rug. It was unwise to do this in her yard because infants who lived in the house spent most of the day in the garden, which occupied part of the backyard, and it should always be clean there. Reaching the end of the street, Anacaona turned left. Now there were artisan settlements below. Anacaona liked to walk among their homes and workshops with her father or her friends when they were allowed to go to Tenochtitlan for the day. However, this rarely occurred. This beautiful city was very far away, and it took a long boat ride to get to it. Things made by craftsmen were often displayed in front of the houses. They would be exchanged for other goods, and among these items was everything that the townspeople needed. Beyond the artisan settlement, the market could be seen. Craftsmen from other cities of the large expanse of Aztlan brought their crafts there. And the more the state grew, the more diverse the goods in this market became. Right behind the market, there was a large, magnificent building that housed the Calmecac, the school for children of the city's nobility. This school was attended primarily by boys who would replace their fathers in the civil service, the sons of priests, councilmen, judges, and personal ticitl of Tlatoc. There was also a court not far from the school. Flying over the courthouse yard, Anacaona saw how the judges were taught to put on their intricate clothes. To Anacaona, who saw mostly the clothing of ordinary people, the judges' caps and their boots with bows seemed funny, although they were interesting in their own way. Just a moment after, Anacaona was already flying over the center of Tenochtitlan. There were government buildings and a whole block of temples. In the very center of this block stood Huey Teocalli, a giant pyramid decorated with reliefs, stretching into the sky with two smaller temples. These were temples of Huitzilopochtli, the ticitl of sun and war, and Tlaloc, the ticitl of rain and fertility. Leading up to the pyramid, on a platform there was a terrifying exhibition of human skulls. This was the largest ticitl in the city. Suddenly, at the top of this pyramid between the temples, Anacaona saw the silhouette of a female figure. Anacaona immediately recognized her mother, although she had never seen her. Yes, Chimalli had said she died in childbirth, but Anacaona stubbornly continued to believe that there was some kind of mistake, that her mother was alive, and that one day they would meet. So, this is what their meeting would be like. Anacaona rose so high that she was level with the top of the pyramid and accelerated her flight. Her mother's face was glowing. It glowed so brightly that it seemed as if she would go blind when she looked at it, but Anacaona flew toward this light. She landed at the top of the pyramid and rushed to her mother, but suddenly Anacaona's hands and feet seemed to have turned to stone. She tried to run as hard as she could, but she could barely move. The pyramid literally anchored Anacaona to its blocks of stone.
Anacaona,
said the silhouette of a woman.
You must wake up.
The voice was beautiful, just like her mother's voice in her other dreams. She often cried in her sleep when she thought that she would never be able to hear this voice in reality.
You must wake up.
The woman's voice repeated, and then the pyramid began to shake. One block after another began to fall from it. The silhouette of her mother crumbled into thousands of small fragments, and these fragments cascaded down like corn kernels. From the top of the pyramid, Anacaona saw the destruction of the city over which she had just flown. Roofs and walls of houses fell, burying people under them, and statues of Tito fell, collapsing into pieces as they tumbled down. Above the surface of the lake, always serene, a wave suddenly surged, rushing toward the city. Anacaona realized that not a single person on the island could escape from this giant wave. Everyone was doomed.
Anacaona, you must wake up.
She heard her mother's voice again in her head. Anacaona shuddered and woke up. At the same moment, fragments of the wall of her home rained down on her. Anacaona jumped up and rushed to the exit of the house, but the roof caved in and blocked the way to her escape. The straw fell on the coals of yesterday's fire and immediately ignited. Anacaona rushed to the window and managed to jump out of the house before the flames engulfed it and left it in ruins. The street was in the same chaos that Anacaona had just seen from a bird's-eye view in her dream. Voices screamed all around her. Women ran around with children in their arms, and some men tried to pull a man screaming in pain out from under the ruins of a house. The earth was moving like the waves of the sea. Even the mountains that were visible on the horizon seemed to be shuddering. Those who kept their wits about them had already begun to flee into the jungle. Others followed them. Anacaona fled to the jungle with everyone else. She ran, but she smiled because, for the first time in her life, she had finally seen her mother. Thus began the most terrible earthquake in the history of her people. Chapter 5. The Guest from Overseas. Anacaona, who had been dozing off, opened her eyes. The forest surrounding the girl now was not at all like in her homeland. Instead of arches of mangrove trees, under which an entire village could freely pass, this forest consisted of low pines and other trees that grew between. There was no wet, springy jungle ground under the girl's feet. These trees and squat bushes grew on sandy, scant soil. There was also no fog in this forest, even now at dawn, as was usual in the jungles of her homeland. Anacaona closed her eyes and sniffed the scent of the forest. New smells, unfamiliar to her, spread out in colored patterns in her imagination. The color and shape of the patterns gave her clues about what particular plants, grasses, or foliage could help heal. Out of the huge variety of new smells, she felt something very strong. This particular smell told her that there was a plant in this forest that could cure the most difficult ailments. Where could she find it? However, the events of the previous morning began to disturb Anacaona with renewed vigor, and her study of smells had to be postponed. The boats had returned to Tlaluacatli, and now she was completely alone in an unexplored land. What to do? The military men, prowling through the forest with their bright long ticitl, did not notice her in the pre-dawn twilight, but it could happen during the day. As if to confirm Anacaona's terrible conclusion, the wind carried the sounds of human speech to her. Before dawn, Anacaona, exhausted, had sat down on a sandy hummock and immediately dozed off. She didn't notice that she had stopped near the road, and now the Mexihkah were passing by her. They walked either in pairs or individually and held spears, coils of rope, and various sticks with 3 or 4 unknown metal ends, and some carried huge, but hardly heavy boxes on their backs. A man galloped along the road, overtaking these people, riding a huge 4-legged animal that Anacaona had already noticed early in the morning from afar. The people on foot gave way to the man, and some took off their hats and bowed to the rider. Cautiously glancing at the road, Anacaona began to retreat into the forest thicket. After making sure that she could no longer be noticed from the road, she began to inspect and study the unfamiliar trees and grasses. Anacaona was very thirsty, but she didn't see any traces of water nearby. Sorting through the vegetation, the young woman began to pull out their stems. If they didn't taste bitter, Anacaona would eat their juicy flesh.
Luis, do you really think that our old clothes will be useful to his family?
Nuno asked. The horse under him had strained his legs the day before and was now limping on the front right, which was why Nuno fidgeted in the saddle every now and then. Luis, who was riding next to him, shrugged his shoulders.
Who knows? Everything comes in handy on the farm, especially for poor people. Well, the rich definitely don't become soldiers. That's a well-known thing. It would be better, of course, to give a purse with gold or, at least, silver.
There's silver, too,
Nuno answered. He reached into his bosom, took out a small but heavy bundle, examined it carefully once more, and put it back.
And to tell the truth, you don't have to give too much.
Luis continued.
After all, the son was killed in the service of the king, so let the king help them. Otherwise, they might become proud and quit working. They will think that they themselves have become the masters. Oh, trouble.
Suddenly, a scream came from the depths of the forest. Nuno and Luis exchanged glances. The scream was undoubtedly from a woman. Nuno spurred his horse and, bending down to his withers, rushed into the thicket. Luis rode after him. Among the juniper bushes, they saw an unfamiliar, apparently alien, dark-skinned woman. She was dressed in a simple linen dress, with gold bracelets adorning her arms and a necklace of precious stones around her neck. The young woman's right leg was clamped in the jaws of a trap.
Damn poachers.
Luis swore.
They were banned from the lands of Don Leandro. Under his father, such people used to be flogged for trapping one rabbit, just for show, to prevent others from hunting in the Lord's forest.
Nuno jumped off his horse and ran up to the woman. The wound on her trapped leg was bleeding. With the help of Luis and a strong oak branch, Nuno parted the jaws of the trap and freed her leg. From a bag strapped to his saddle, he took out a flask of clean water and a piece of clean cloth. Nuno always carried this bag with him after an incident where he was unable to help a wounded peasant. After washing the wound and wrapping a cloth around her leg, he finally asked the girl, who was recovering,
Are you from around here? How did you end up here?
The young woman wiped tears from her eyelashes and said something in a language unknown to Nuno. She could tell from the stranger's face that he didn't want to hurt her.
Luis, do you understand anything she is saying?
No, maybe she is a Marrano girl, or maybe from the Moriscos. Although to tell the truth, She doesn't really look like them either. Dark, but not the same.
Anacaona tried to get up from the ground, but her wounded foot was pierced by such a sharp pain that she screamed and fell unconscious on the soft forest ground. When consciousness returned to Anacaona, she saw a canopy of exotic, almost transparent fabric above her. She was lying on a soft bed that smelled of flowers. She raised her head and saw an elderly woman sitting next to her on a chair. Anacaona immediately remembered that she was on Tlaluacatli. The woman worked quickly and silently with knitting needles, from which a wide, fluffy piece of handwork hung. There were balls of yarn on her lap. Next to the woman sat a young man, whom Anacaona recognized as her rescuer. He was holding a board in front of him and moving a stick with a piece of gray clamped to the end of it. Noticing that Anacaona was awake, the woman raised her head and looked at the young man.
"Your guest is awake, Nuno?
She said indifferently.
Maybe she needs something? Otherwise, I'll go to my room."
The young man got up and went over to the bed.
You may go, Grassa,
He said.
Tell them downstairs to bring fruit, meat, bread, and a jug of lemon juice with honey.
Approaching the bed, Nuno timidly pulled back the curtain.
How's the leg?
He asked. The girl smiled and said nothing. She tried to get up, but as soon as her foot touched the floor, she winced in pain.
Grassa. And a new bandage with healing ointment.
Nuno called after the maid. Cautiously glancing at the dog dozing at the threshold, the maid left the room. Soon Anacaona's wound had been treated again. Nuno personally served her food and poured a drink into the girl's cup, which she clearly liked. By the way the girl ate, it was obvious that she was hungry. Nuno showed Anacaona the board with a piece of paper on it. In the outlines of the figure depicted on this sheet, drawn with the stick, Anacaona immediately recognized herself. Nuno tapped his chest with his fist.
Nuno.
Anacaona nodded and put her palm to her chest.
Nuidal ticitl Anacaona. My name is Anacaona.
Na.
Nuno repeated diligently. The girl laughed but nodded affably. She took the board from Nuno's hands, drew a leg on paper and said,
Ticitl. Leg.
Ticitl?
Repeated Nuno. Guessing the meaning of this word, he said,
A leg.
Anacaona nodded happily. Nuno wrote next to Anacaona's drawing, leg. Then she put her index and middle fingers on her palm and began to step over them.
Zinanimi. Walk.
Nuno wrote down this word as well. Making more drawings, the young people soon began to understand the meaning of unfamiliar words, which they identified by these drawings. There was something menacing and beautiful at the same time in the melody of the language the girl spoke.
How did you get here?
Nuno asked and looked at Anacaona's big, beautiful eyes. Anacaona realized what the most natural question would be. She showed the waves of the sea and the boat with her hands and said,
Huey Teocalli. Big water.
Nuno took the portrait of Anacaona, surrounded it with figures of a man, a woman, and children in a few strokes of a quill, and looked questioningly at the girl.
Campa no senilistly? Where is my family?
Anacaona guessed at his question. She again depicted the sea and the boat, and then strongly, as if she were driving someone away, waved her arms to the side. Nuno understood that the girl came from an unknown country across the sea. Nuno thought she was probably from Africa. He also learned that she was 17 years old and that she had no mother, only a father. With the help of drawings, Nuno told her that he was also 17 years old, that he was the son of a man who owned a large estate, and that he had a dog named Duarte. At the mention of his name, the dog poked his wet nose into Anacaona's sore leg and happily wagged his tail. Nuno simply forgot all about Estela and the fact that Anacaona was settled in Estela's room. The servants' conversations about the foreign girl that Nuno and Luis found in the forest quickly reached Leandro and his wife, and they both came to see her.
Maybe she got into the forest with poachers?
Leandro asked his son suspiciously. Manuela went up to the girl, looked into her eyes, took her hands in her own, and examined them.
This girl is not in the habit of rough work.
Manuela said,
And she has not been abused either. Most importantly, she's wearing jewelry. Did she run away from her rich parents' house?
So, who is she?
Leandro wondered. He brought and showed Anacaona a rough map of Europe, but it turned out that the shapes on the paper did not mean anything to her. However, in the corners of the map were painted all sorts of monsters that, judging by the fins, came from the sea.
Maybe these people also hold their own festivals?
Anacaona thought as she looked at the monsters. Anacaona pointed her finger at the image of the hippocampus, a sea creature with the head of a horse and the tail of a fish, and looked questioningly at Leandro. He exchanged glances with his wife. Manuela only understood that this animal was a mystery to Anacaona, the same as anyone. One riddle continued to generate another, and they multiplied, and multiplied. Something, however, was clarified when Anacaona was examined by a doctor summoned specially for her. When he retreated the wound on her leg, he wrapped it with a bandage and began to tie the ends. Anacaona resolutely stopped him. She unwrapped the leg, then bandaged it again, and when the bandage began to run out, she tore the rest along the middle with a sharp movement. Lastly, she tied the pieces at the base, brought one of them towards the other around the leg, and then tied the ends. At the sight of her skillful binding, the doctor was speechless.
This girl knows things beyond our skills.
He muttered. Indeed, such a method of securing bandages, a very sensible one, was not yet known to him. In the evening of the same day, Estela also had a chance to experience a shock. Estela met Manuela at the entrance to Leandro's house, and the girl immediately noticed the unusual expression on Manuela's face. The lady of the house was clearly bewildered.
Estela,
She said,
you won't be able to stay in your room today, maybe in the room of one of the maids.
What happened?
Estela asked with surprise.
Nuno found a strange young woman in the forest. She speaks an unknown language. She's hurt, and Nuno put her in your room to heal.
Even if there was still some uncertainty about Nuno and Estela's engagement, Estela considered her room in this house to be her own. Needless to say, she was understandably shocked, but Estela was very good at controlling herself. Entering her room, she greeted Anacaona with a smile and, tapping on the cross on her chest, told the girl her name. After looking closely at the patterns embroidered on Anacaona's dress, Estela took the scarlet ribbon she had found on the shore from under her sleeve and showed it to Anacaona. Estela still carried this ribbon with its incomprehensible writing with her, so as not to forget to show it to the instructors at the university. Anacaona gave a startled cry.
Campa Tupac? Where is Tupac?
Estela didn't say anything. She briefly grasped Nuno's elbow and, without looking at his face, left.
Well, what can you say about her?
Manuela asked. She had waited for Estela outside the door.
First of all, she identified that strange ribbon that Nuno and I found on the shore not far from the dead soldier.
Estela said. She took the ribbon out from under her sleeve again and showed it to Manuela.
That is most important, and this connection will have to be investigated by Don Diego, my father's deputy, who oversees the deanery in this region. As for the girl herself, dark skin suits some girls.
Estela sighed and continued after a short pause.
Her wound will heal soon. However, I don't understand. When a girl wanders into the forest, it usually happens to a simpleton, but this girl is wearing so much gold jewelry that she can only come from a very rich family. And maybe...
Maybe, what?
Manuela could not wait for Estela to continue.
You say, according to Nuno, that she came by sea. Maybe she's a merchant's daughter? Or maybe she strayed from some family of Moranos or Moriscos who are now fleeing the country from Castile.
But what are the Moranos or Moriscos doing here? Leandro says they're running away from us too. They are running only to the north. Why would they come to our land?
Anyway, this girl is in trouble.
Estela said calmly.
And the Lord will bless your family for the fact that you have aided her. I hope she got her gold jewelry in an honest way. Sometimes such girls are used by the most notorious villains. I'm sure you know that, Donna Manuela.
In Leandro's house, Estela passed the endurance test through to the end despite the fact that no matter what conversation she started with Nuno, the young man's gaze soon began to fog up, and he strove to return to his other guest. Estela refused to spend the night with the maids or in the room that was prepared for her. That evening she went home accompanied by the servants, who had not even rested after their hard day.
Leave me alone, Mom!
She shouted to her mother, who was surprised by her sudden and very late return.
Nuno has a new bride! A mix between a monkey and a wharf girl from the poorest port. And in order not to be found out, she pretends to be a foreigner.
With these words, Estela rushed to her room, slammed the door loudly and sobbed. Nuno had a hard time that night, too, having seated their son on a chair in front of them. His parents told him how much Estela must have been offended by the appearance of Anacaona in her room.
Even if Estela didn't show it to you, my son, she's deeply offended.
Leandro was saying.
She's a very tenacious, strong-willed, but restrained girl, and you have to respect that. Anacaona should leave.
Looking at her husband's face, Manuela nodded in agreement.
This Anacaona does not speak our language, and our customs are alien to her.
Leandro continued.
We don't know who she is, where she came from, or how she came to our land. She must leave our house as soon as possible. She could be dangerous to you.
I don't see any danger in her.
Nuno kept saying.
While we don't know who else can help her or where she needs to return to, we will put her in more danger by forcing her to leave now.
And what about Estela?
Said the mother.
Believe me, son, nowadays such acquaintances and such girls are not easily found. Oh, if you only knew how many stupid, uncouth, and boring fools there are for each one such as Estela. If you only knew. You can't imagine what happiness Estela can bring you. Yes, you're just spoiled by your comfortable friendship with this most worthy girl. You've seen too few unhappy families. Don't you understand that it is the wife who makes her husband a man and a member of society?
Don Leandro blushed deeply.
And then, what if your Anacaona is a girl from a Marrano or Morisco family?
He hastily interrupted Manuela.
Can you guarantee she's not from their community? After all, you know that Isabella of Castile is currently expelling them from her country. The cup of patience for her people has overflowed. I am sure that our king will do the same soon. Those infidels drink the blood of Christian babies. Didn't Padre Pablo tell you this?
By the way, in Castile, anyone who decides to marry a baptized girl from the Marranos will have to bring la limpieza de sangre.
Manuela echoed her husband.
A certificate of purity of blood. So far, this is only in Castile, but soon such laws will reach us too. And how, for example, will the same Anacaona provide that if she came from nowhere, does not believe in the only God who exists, and does not speak our language?
Manuela, we are not talking about marriage.
Leandro shouted.
We're just talking about.
Nuno jumped up from his chair and ran out of the room.
Leandro,
Manuela cried.
Maybe this girl will only stay with us until her family is found. Maybe then Nuno will calm down and she will go away.
Anacaona stayed at Don Leandro's house, and it surprised her at every step. The clothes of the household and even Nuno himself seemed too warm to her. Anacaona would have suffocated in them. Her tribesmen always left at least half of their bodies exposed, despite the fact that they wore more jewelry than garments. These people's faces, hairstyles, and jewelry did not tell Anacaona to which social class they belonged, but their clothes and demeanor seemed to indicate it was not the lowest one. Chains and thin bracelets made of gold were worn only by Nuno's parents and their guests, and they were worn with incomprehensible pride as if they were awards received from Wyatt Latoni himself. However, ordinary people often had metal tools in their hands for which Anacaona's people would have given a fortune in their homeland. So sturdy and durable were all these scissors, fireplace tongs, jugs, cups, and tools of the peasants. Even the door handles were made of it. Benches, cabinets, carpets, tapestries, and ornate caskets. Anacaona guessed the purpose of all of these things. These were found in her house as well. However, it bore the imprint of a completely different world here. The only thing that really struck Anacaona was the mirror. When Anacaona first saw her reflection, she cried out in fright,
Tlaluacatli? What is it?
And she pointed her finger at the mirror. Nuno laughed.
It's a mirror, Anacaona. Mirror.
He picked up a board with a piece of paper and wrote down
Tlaluacatli?
and his translation.
What is it?
Nuno went to the mirror and stood next to the young woman. She cried out again. Nuno waved his hand, and Anacaona did the same, bursting into loud laughter. Seeing their shared reflections, Nuno suddenly realized that he would now be very lonely without Anacaona.
Tlaluacatli. Clear as water.
She said.
Tlika amo atlan titani. But why doesn't it leak?
Anacaona touched the mirror with her hand and looked questioningly at Nuno, who, meanwhile, was quickly drawing on the paper with a quill. He was writing down the new words and making drawings. Anacaona's mind was already swarming with hypotheses about how these people possibly melted the stone, making it smooth and hard again, and how it then was polished. That was how mirrors were made in her homeland. Nuno abandoned all his usual activities, hunting, pigeons, trips to artisans' workshops, and visits to the stables. Even books became tiresome to him, and now he only took up paper and quill to make drawings for Anacaona and memorize new words. The language of Anacaona was easier for Nuno to learn than the Portuguese was for Anacaona. Anacaona began to walk slowly, although with a slight limp, and they walked together through the surrounding groves and fields. Nuno showed Anacaona fruit trees and vegetables growing in their fields. Anacaona tasted an apple for the first time in her life, which was surprising for Nuno. Apples, in his opinion, should grow everywhere. He also took her to the village, where they laughed together at women who snatched up children and ran away at the sight of a dark, incomprehensible girl with tattoos. All this, too, was understandable to the keen, laughing Anacaona. Mysterious animals harnessed to platforms on wooden circles no longer frightened her. In her homeland, the wheel was not used, and the Mexihkah merchants carried loads on their backs. But as a child, Anacaona had a toy, a wooden animal, that could be rolled on the floor because it was put on wheels. It was just such structures on wheels that the local Mexihkah used. Nuno gave Anacaona the opportunity to get to know the horses. The girl almost cried when she felt the tender lips of the horse, and it ate the piece of bread she held out for it. Soon, Anacaona was riding, and she immediately began to hold herself in the saddle more confidently than many cavalrymen held themselves. In the evenings, they looked at drawings in books by candlelight. The main book in the Nuno family, of course, was the Bible. Nuno told Anacaona about Christ, and she agreed that it was impossible to save humanity without sacrificing a person. In confirmation of her words, she told Nuno about the rituals in her homeland. However, her stories did not explain much to the young man. The concepts that Anacaona tried to convey with gestures, several dozen words, and drawings turned out to be too complicated to understand. Nuno completely lost his head for this beautiful, kind, and amazingly understanding young girl, and Anacaona liked him more and more every day. Her life had never been so carefree before. In this house, there was everything that the body and soul could wish for, and no one demanded anything from her in exchange. However, the more Nuno and Anacaona became attached to one another, The darker Don Leandro's face became when he looked at the couple from afar, and his father's attitude toward Anacaona did not escape Nuno's attention. He firmly decided he would leave his father's house with Anacaona once the girl finally recovered, and would not return until Anacaona found her family and secured reliable protection.